Merci à toutes et tous de vous joindre aujourd'hui à nous et un grand merci notamment à notre conférencière invitée, Mona Fawaz. Je suis Katharina Niemeyer, professeure à l'école des médias à la faculté de communication de l'UQAM. Et c'est donc au nom du CELAT et en tant que directrice du CELAT-UQAM que j'ai le plaisir d'introduire aujourd'hui la 3e conférence de la série Les temps qui viennent. Les CELAT, c'est le Centre de recherche culture, art, société, fondé en 1944. Il a changé plusieurs fois de nom depuis. Et puis, il est constitué en tant que centre depuis 1975. Puis, c'est depuis 2000 qu'il existe aussi en tant que centre tri-universitaire et interdisciplinaire, intégrant les chercheurs de l'Université de Laval, l'Université du Québec à Montréal, de l'Université du Québec à Chicoutimi et d'autres universités comme l'UDM et McGill. Donc, la série de conférences Les temps qui viennent fait partie de la programmation du CELAT qui se concentre actuellement sur les différentes facettes de la pluralisation dans nos sociétés. Et c'est dans ce cadre que le CELAT-UQAM a lancé cette année la série Les temps qui viennent afin de proposer un regard et une compréhension critique et interdisciplinaire des phénomènes culturels, artistiques et sociaux. Plus particulièrement dans le contexte actuel qui est issu d'une pandémie, d'une crise écologique et économique accentuée, d'un renforcement des inégalités sociales et d'une incertitude quasi généralisée, il nous semble important de continuer de faire vivre les débats et réflexions qui doivent secouer nos façons de penser et d'agir justement sur les temps qui viennent. C'est dans le cadre de cette série que nous avons donc l'immense plaisir d'accueillir Mona Fawaz aujourd'hui en direct de Beyrouth. And I will give now the same text for Estelle in English because it will be mixed today. So Estelle, she's the coordinator of the CELAT, will say almost the same thing in English just for the record. Thank you, Estelle.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and a special thanks to our invited speaker, Mona Fawaz. So I'm Estelle Grambois-Bernard, coordinator of the CELAT-UQAM, and I have the pleasure to introduce the 3rd conference of our series, The Times to Come. The CELAT is the Research Center Culture, Art and Society. It was founded in 1944 and became an official center in 1975. It is now bringing together 3 different universities, Laval University, University of Quebec in Montreal, and University of Quebec in Chicoutimi, and regroups scholars from these and other national and international universities. The conference series, The Times to Come, is part of the CELAT research program and has been launched this year by the CELAT-UQAM in order to offer a critical and transdisciplinary perspective on cultural, artistic, and social phenomena. More specifically, in the current context of a pandemic situation, the reinforcement of the ecological and economic crisis, as well as the social inequalities and a sort of generalized uncertainty about the future, we wish to continue the discussions and reflections in order to shake our ways of thinking and to act on the times to come. So we are very happy to welcome Mona Fawaz to this conference series, and Carole Lévesque, professor at the Design School and member of the CELAT, who will now introduce our speaker, and then the conference that lasts about 30 to 40 minutes will happen. So, Carole?
Merci, Estelle. Ça me fait très plaisir de t'accueillir, Mona, dans cette rencontre, de voir aussi certains visages familiers qu'on n'a pas l'occasion de voir assez souvent. Mona Fawaz est professeure associée en études et planification urbaine à l'Université américaine de Beyrouth, où elle est également coordonnatrice de la maîtrise en planification, design et politiques urbaines. Elle est diplômée d'une maîtrise et d'un doctorat de la MIT en planification urbaine. Et son travail se concentre sur l'histoire urbaine de Beyrouth, sur la justice sociale et spatiale, sur les relations entre l'occupation informelle de la ville et du territoire avec les notions de loi, de propriété, d'espace et de pratique de planification. Elle a été directrice du programme de recherche Social Justice and City à la Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy à Beyrouth. Elle a été aussi fellow à la Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies à Harvard et elle est cofondatrice du Beirut Urban Lab, un centre de recherche qui regroupe décideurs politiques, militants et chercheurs du Liban et de la région sur les questions de l'inclusion urbaine et de la reprise post-conflit. Elle est l'auteure de nombreux articles scientifiques, on n'en fera pas la liste ici aujourd'hui. Elle a édité aussi plusieurs collections d'essais. Elle publie régulièrement dans la presse de Beyrouth pour y défendre le besoin d'améliorer les conditions des quartiers informels pour protéger l'espace public, adopter des pratiques de planification plus inclusives et plus généralement de défendre le droit à la ville. Donc, c'est avec cette grande expérience qu'elle va nous parler aujourd'hui de la situation qu'on pourrait dire post-explosion à Beyrouth, des stratégies qui sont déployées à la fois par les citoyens et par les grands acteurs du développement urbain qui n'agissent pas toujours, malheureusement, avec les mêmes objectifs en tête. Donc, Mona, ça me fait très plaisir de te recevoir aujourd'hui. Je demanderai à tout le monde de fermer leur micro pendant la conférence et nous prendrons les questions lorsque Mona aura terminé. Merci, Mona.
Merci, merci Carole de cette introduction. Et désolée, d'abord, je commence simplement par m'excuser parce que c'est beaucoup plus facile pour moi de parler en anglais. Donc, j'espère que ça ne va pas être un inconvénient pour les gens qui sont venus à cette conférence. I want to also thank you really dearly, Carol, for this invitation. We miss you here in the department, and you definitely left many marks that we continue to think with. And so I'm very excited to be re-engaging with you and also with colleagues. I want to thank Estelle for her patience dealing with my emails being thrown consistently into the junk box and insisting on still having me. So thank you so much for this. Thank you, Katarina, for the introduction and the follow-ups, and everyone really for making the time to attend. It makes me really happy to see how many people I know in the audience, and I look forward to your comments and those of the other members of the audience. I want to also make a quick disclaimer. The explosion has only happened 3 months ago, and we're really struggling and trying to understand what it means for the city, what opportunities it may create, what disasters it may trigger. So I am not offering a well-typed paper that to work with, but rather speculative reflections and thoughts that I hope we can discuss together by way of making sense of what is happening. I see many lovers of Beirut, Lebanese or not, and it'll be great to think with you. I have a PowerPoint with a few images that I'd like to share. So I'll start with sharing my screen. The work I present today is very much a work. It's not allowing me to share. Excuse me. So the work I'm presenting today is very much work that's done as an outcome of collaborative participation with colleagues in the Urban Lab, while the reflections and the mistakes are entirely mine. Some of the research is done collaboratively, and I'll point out whenever needed who's on the project and how. So this is the picture that went all over the world. It is the Beirut Blast, which was triggered by, as everyone knows now, 2,800 tons of ammonium nitrate that were callously stored in the city's port a few hundred meters from people's homes. They exploded to date in unconfirmed circumstances some 3 months ago on August 4, 2020. On that evening, people in the city felt their homes shaking everywhere, giving the impression that an earthquake was actually happening. And so many of us, including my kids and I, ran away, hid under tables, did what we had learned to do in an earthquake, and that saved many lives and prevented many people from being injured. The explosion that followed was massive and has been equated to earthquakes. People are still counting what it equates to and how. Suffice it to say that it was heard all the way to nearby Cyprus. It left the districts in devastated forms. What you're seeing here are pictures taken from residents in their own home. This is a war photographer who lives in Marem Khair, who shared with me these two pictures, like in the minutes following the blast. You can feel the immediacy of the disaster. The 3 main hospitals in the area were fully incapacitated, forcing their evacuation. Newborn infants were clinging for their lives, and their images circulated amidst the horror of the destruction. Adults, children rushed to hospitals where doctors directed them to other regional institutions, many treating the wounds, including colleagues here at the American University, without having access to proper electricity. When the counts were done the second day, more than 200 people were already dead. Their number were increased in the days after. Some 3,000 were injured with different levels of severity. Dozens were trapped for days under debris. Weeks after the blast, thousands of people are still unable to return home. In the days after the blast, the districts around the explosion were cut off of electricity and water services. The physical damages incurred to the housing were estimated by the World Bank to be about $4 billion, a little less, a little more, and another 3 million were estimated in losses in 3 billion were estimated in losses in economic flows. Now, keep in mind that this is a country in severe financial bankruptcy where the GDP is not reaching these kinds of numbers. More should be accounted for wages lost and workers who are unemployed. To speak of the effects of the blast on the districts, we need to recognize that these neighborhoods were very different in their formation. We have, on the one hand, a neighborhood like Beirut downtown, known by many under the name of Solidaire, the private real estate company that undertook its recovery in the post-Civil War. Recovery is potentially the word. In practice, Solidaire turned the neighborhood into a massive real estate speculative playground, one that will inspire many projects in the region, from Rabat's Marina to Amman's Abdali and beyond. Many cities were inspired by this approach, which left, sadly, Beirut with a historic core unrebuilt, and instead many large parking lots, many held by banks, high-end buildings mostly empty, and very little life. On the other edge, and I think I have a few pictures. So this is, for example, one of the pictures that Solidaire advertises, the historic core. You can see the beautiful historic architecture turned into high-end shopping malls and an imaginary of a high-end lifestyle. This is the building to your left. I know there's a few architects, so I thought I should put the Herzog de Meuron well-known building and the impacts of the blast on it. And to your right, the Nahar building, again, devastated. The other edge of Beirut has the neighborhood of Karantina. Here we are in the backyard of the port. The district houses everything the city doesn't want to see. So it is the big warehouses for the private company that collects waste in Beirut. It is army barracks, public hospitals serving many disadvantaged people. And as you see on these pictures, the homes of families that have been reconstructed during the 1990s and that remain in very fragile form. So you can see warehouses, you can see homes demolished, and a very different circumstance for the recovery, as ownership here is more contested, there's more public land and a very strong presence for the army. In the middle are the well-known districts of Marem Khail and Jemmaise, known for their heritage buildings, that what's often known as the Lebanese typical architecture. So triple arch buildings were demolished, and you can see here the remnants of what these homes looked like, including here the studio of one of our colleagues at AUB. So these are elements of the heritage destruction that have been very well documented by colleagues. When you see things of the sort, the question arises, how do cities recover from disasters of this magnitude? Beirut, of course, is no stranger to disasters. In only my lifespan, the city has witnessed a 15-year civil war, an Israeli invasion, several wars with Israel that involved air raids, and now a port blast. mind you, I'm only 48. So if we go even further back, you'll think you would want to know that the city has also witnessed many battles, also an earthquake, and even a tsunami. But to stay in our contemporary history, when and how do we declare a city recovered? And what does it mean to recover anyway? What is recovery? And most importantly, what factors will determine whether Beirut can or not recover as a city rich with its social diversity? Tracing the evolution of the concept of recovery, my colleague Huwaid Al-Harithi, who also co-founded the Beirut Urban Lab, has shown the evolution of an idea that began in the late 1970s with the notion of physical reconstruction. So at the time, recovery was very much imagined as a process through which buildings or volumes can be returned to what they were at the moment of destruction. This is a very common way of thinking among architects of how reconstruction should happen, that we need to restore things the way they used to be, that it's imperative to recover these forms. Since then, of course, the concept has developed a lot, and people began to realize that what needs to be recovered with the buildings are people's memories and all the intangible practices and senses that connect communities to the places they care for. But as ideas developed and more disasters happened, and we had the luxury to reflect on the post-earthquakes of Istanbul, Chile, Haiti, and others, but also the floods of Katrina. The concept of recovery has been really enriched. And today we really think that recovery cannot happen at all in terms of returning a neighborhood to what it used to be. Rather, we think of recovery as a process that is set in place and in which cities are able to bring back those people who used to live in them and potentially new ones, to set a course of reinvigorating its life. This position is widely espoused by planners and designers like Campanella or Diane Davis, who have acknowledged that disruptions of the scale of the Beirut Blast, and I'm really thinking here again of Chile or Haiti, to name a few of the well-documented cases, should be read in the course of the urban patterns and processes in which they happen. So if we say that we are going to focus on processes, then it's really important intellectually that we say that these processes that we are going to set actually happen in a context where already numerous processes had occurred. And as such, we reconceptualize the blast no longer as a simple interruption that we will reverse, but rather as a powerful incident that reacts with trends that existed before in cities and that is likely to trigger numerous reactions, potentially not harmonious ones, that will themselves be embedded in the social and institutional hierarchies of the cities in which they will happen. And these will carry the aspirations, the desires, the visions of people who live in these cities or who are interested with their governance. This in turn, of course, means, and I think this is where it's difficult, that the recovery is a struggle. And it's a struggle, particularly in context where who is the custodian of the common good, or who are the residents who should call themselves the owners of this district, or who will be the custodians who will direct this, are not clear. So recovery becomes this moment in which meanings, institution, and practices are being negotiated. And we've seen this documented in other cases. I'll give a shout out here to Diane Davis's work on Mexico City after the earthquake, where she shows the extent to which that moment of the earthquake becomes a powerful remobilization of society, a way in which city dwellers manage to imagine a different future. And as they do so, and as they really get involved in the recovery, manage to actually challenge political structures. And she even hypothesizes that this leads eventually to a transformation in the entire political system in Mexico. This is certainly what a lot of my activist friends and colleagues here in Lebanon aspire to. I am not ready to call the bet on this. I will try to come back to this if I have enough time at the end. But this is certainly something that we're thinking with. But to take you back to Beirut and to think about this blast and what it has done in the city, I want to try and locate it in one of the very important trends that existed in the district, so that we apply this method and think about it. The blast happened at a moment in which Beirut was subject already to many different forces that were changing its fabrics. And one of those forces was a rapid, intensive real estate redevelopment that had existed, that had rocked the city for some 30 years. So to look at the blast, I'm showing here first the city, but potentially let's just focus on the neighborhoods of that were demolished. And I want to show you here that in brown, in the dark brown, are the demolition permits that had been filed in Beirut only between 2000 and 2015. So every purple dot here is actually a demolition permit that was filed at the Order of Engineers for a building to be destroyed. In addition, every building that you see on this map in turquoise is actually a building that had been evicted fully from its residents. The developer had filed a building permit for a new building, but they had not really rebuilt it because they had not demolished it, they had simply evicted it and left it. So you see the amount of vacancy that exists, the amount of displacement that exists in the districts. And displacement was the main thing that was on the mind of activists, of planners, of people who cared about the neighborhoods, and also of residents at the moment of the blast. Many of us feared that the scenario that we had seen happen during the Lebanese civil war and its aftermath, which is the emptying out of Beirut's historic core, which you would see here, would actually extend to these districts, whereby residents will find in a moment of severe financial meltdown that it's very difficult to repair their homes. Keep in mind that a financial meltdown in a country like Lebanon means that the cost of aluminum and glass is very expensive. It means that the cost of repairing a structural damage, particularly when we talk to residents bringing steel to consolidate structure, is prohibitive. And so as we witness the kind of difficulties that people were facing, but also even in terms of whether they would want to come back in a district that was also posh, where rents were going up and where people had begun to really struggle for paying rents in the months preceding the blast, because they were getting impoverished, because they were losing their jobs amidst the COVID and the financial crisis. And so a lot of us were very afraid and saying we should really make sure that the residents of the district come back. But then when we laid out this map, we realized that actually the displacement precedes by far the explosion, and that if one is serious about understanding a post-disaster recovery as a moment of understanding, of dealing with the forces that would prevent the formation of an inclusive city, or just simply about being able to set a track to recover neighborhoods, then it's difficult to assume that you cannot take into consideration these demolitions. A similar argument can be made on heritage. This is really a map in the making, so it's sketchy, and I'll apologize to George, who's in the audience, because I'm sure the modern buildings are missing, because the buildings identified as heritage here are those identified originally by the Directorate General of Archaeology. And what we tried to do is, again, color every building in turquoise and lay under it which ones were demolished in pink. And you see that there's a substantial number of buildings that were actually also lost in the years preceding the blast. So while many colleagues, including Georges, have been wonderful voices in defending heritage and seeking to rebuild it and protect it from demolition in the aftermath of the blast, We know that this demolition was ongoing, so that it makes very little sense to imagine restoring buildings if we know that what's going to happen next is that developers will come and re-demolish them. We also know that that population displacement had translated into a lot of vacancy in the district. So when we say that buildings were being demolished, we also see new patterns of urbanization that clearly do not simply respond to a popular demand, in the sense that they're not building homes for people to live inside them. Instead, what you see on this map with every red dot is a vacant apartment inside a newly built building, a building developed in the post-Civil War era. So when you look at these districts, you realize that when the red dot is very big, it means that the apartment is not even sold. And when it's a blue circle, it's sold, but no one lives in it. And I'm not talking about expats, I'm talking about people who have not put even furniture in the district. So we see districts that were already full of where the building stock was being replaced by empty buildings that were kept vacant for many months without clients. And of course, this is not just the vacant the districts of the Blast. Just to give you an idea, when you zoom back to the work that was happening at the Urban Lab before the Blast, predicting that the financial meltdown will affect enormously the urban fabric, you see that vacancy was really pretty much everywhere, including in the modest neighborhoods, the middle income, lower middle income neighborhoods of Beirut, like Tariq Jdide. When you look at who develops these buildings, I've really only emphasized in this figure the developers who are investment companies and banks. And what you see is that in this particular case, every building that's yellow is developed by a bank, and every building that is purple is developed by investment companies. So we see quite a sizable intervention of people who are building as investment rather than the traditional professional developers who used to be in Beirut. And you will notice that they tend to build the bigger apartments. So when you overlap those banks and those investors with the size of the apartments they are building, in yellow and orange, you will see that they tend to build larger apartments that are kept empty. This presentation is not about financialization in general, but it's important to locate what we mean by financialization as a more deep crisis in the transformation of the city, and against which the Blast is actually happening. So if I allow myself for 2 minutes to just locate that recovery in the background of what was happening in Lebanon and what kind of policies had been set since the end of the Lebanese Civil War, we find that the Blast happens following 30 years in which the central bank incentives, the building incentives, decisions coming from parliament and from successive governments have consistently encouraged banks, investment companies, and foreign expats and people living abroad to invest in the real estate sector in Lebanon. And so the building activities we're seeing are clearly not responding to some supply and demand that we can imagine, but rather responding to the fact that Lebanon needs to attract foreign investments so that it can balance somehow its balance of payments, which you can see on the graph below. Worse, you see that what is happening here on this curve, which is the number of building permits filed every year in Lebanon since 1996, is that indeed they correspond fully to the balance of payment and respond to it, but they also correspond pretty well to the curves that you are seeing here, which are the prices of oil in the Gulf. So we see that this is clearly a rentier economy that is encouraging investments in real estate to attract money for another purpose. I will not comment on the break here. This has more to do with US sanctions on Lebanon and other stuff, but that's for another talk again. But in case you see the discrepancy, I'm just pointing it out. For the general picture of what you see here an array of incentives brought by the central bank that over the years facilitate the process through which banks that were not allowed to hold real estate in Lebanon until 1996 are first allowed and then incentivized to invest in real estate. We also see arrays of housing loans that are rolled out to encourage lower income families, middle income families, and increasingly, eventually, even upper income families to invest in purchasing homes and not even first homes. So we get to the point where by 2018, in the desperate effort to continue to attract foreign investments in a country that cannot anymore do it because the real estate has become so ridiculously expensive that a home in Beirut costs more than a home in Marseille. And for those of you who may not know, Beirut has no public schools, no public hospitals, no permanent electricity, and no water running in the homes that's clean. We buy them bottled. So just imagine that a home in Beirut will cost more than a home in Marseille. And that gives you an idea of what is happening to the substance of the city. What is happening to what we imagine as a place where people need to make a home, to start a business, and to do all the things that we as urbanists say are about the life in the urban, right? The economies, the economy, the culture, the life of urban context. What is happening is they're basically being hijacked towards that end. And it's in that background that we see the explosion actually happening. And we see the implications of this curve on the districts, with everything in red being very high-end developments encouraged by banks and investors, but also in blue, I added what is happening to the old stock where people are getting loans so that they can purchase homes. And so we can imagine that here we have a lower income family that's being forced to leave an apartment because another slightly richer family is benefiting from a state subsidized loan so that they can purchase a home in the city. So if we care about displacement, if we're serious about the fact that we need to recover the neighborhoods, we need to understand how these processes were unraveling and really locate property law, rent regulations, incentives given to every homeowner to stay, to rent, to renovate a home in the background of the blast. I am emphasizing the vulnerability of low-income families, but ironically, most of the vacancies are actually in these areas here below the Rue Pasteur, where you see very high-end buildings that were developed by investment companies and sold to people who really benefited from many years of a peg of the dollar to the Lebanese pound and could hence purchase a relatively luxurious apartment and furnish it really with very high-end stuff. But these buildings are largely empty. So you can imagine that when the blast occurs right here, and the elevators are broken and there's only the central facilities, the shared facilities of the buildings are demolished. The banks that own them have no incentive to repair the buildings. Similarly, the people inside them, there's 2 or 3 apartments, they're not gonna fix the buildings. So we're in a situation where the imagination of continuing the way we were or going back to where we were is impossible. It becomes ridiculous to imagine recovery in some way as merely reversing the blast. And instead, if we're serious about countering the demolition of heritage, if we're serious about recovering the city, then we can do what many of my colleagues and friends, planners wanted to do when it all ended, which is to freeze the whole area, put it under study and start making master plans. It doesn't work this way. Instead, what one needs to do is to see how we can engage the residents and work towards this shared idea and work towards creating a custodian to protect the neighborhoods and support a process of planning. And I say create a custodian because really a lot of these developments, as I showed, are the result of public policy. What I didn't show you in the presentation is the other part of the research that shows that the banks and the developers are themselves the politicians who are doing these regulations. So to imagine that that same state is going to come and now suddenly care for the residents and help them return and recover their homes is really, I mean, to put it nicely, naive. Instead, in cities that lack a custodian of the common good, the process of planning a recovery, but planning more generally the future of the city should start from being able to stitch together residents as custodians, not only residents, actually various groups as custodians of the common good. And I've spoken here really essentially about how financialization shreds that common good, but I could have also talked about other forces that also fracture across the Lebanese society. I think I still have a little bit of time to venture in a more, to more speculative part of the presentation, in which so this is some of the work. I wanted to just show that some of the research that goes behind showing you these maps is a lot of surveys, a lot of archival work to produce information on these issues. And I will skip this historical development of the district to simply go back to the devastated neighborhoods and the moment of the blast, and really lose the second part of the presentation to talk about, so what happens after the blast? What are the reactions, and how can we imagine the putting together of a planning framework in these circumstances? You won't be surprised to know that the state response was total disarray. The fact that the blast came in the heels of a year of protest in which people really rejected this, public authorities as representative of their aspirations did not facilitate the thing. Neither, of course, was the fact that public authorities were clearly responsible for the blast, in the sense that they had stored and knew that the ammonium nitrate was in the port near people's homes, and they had done nothing about it. And here, really the trust is completely broken, and people publicly blame public officials for being responsible for their death. Many activists will say that they are waging a war against us. And that's, again, what's interesting is that when I started reading about post-disaster recoveries elsewhere, we see exactly the same responses among communities, even when it's a natural disaster, where people feel that what killed them is the neglect of public authorities, it's the neglect of the infrastructure that should protect them, whether it's in Mexico or in Haiti. And the result is that it becomes also very difficult for local authorities to try and intervene, because there's so much anger against them, but also because they lack the funds, and they don't have no idea where they're gonna be able to leverage them. Conversely, activists for whom neighborhoods like Mar Mikhael, as you can see here, were the bars and the cafes where they used to spend a lot of time, neighborhoods they really call home, flock the district immediately after the blast, where they try to really sweep, clean, and intervene in the recovery. They demand that the government is rendered accountable, and very quickly we see efforts being put with multiple interventions. I'm only featuring one here quickly, but many interventions where at the scale of the neighborhood, people will squat a space that's available and try to collect food, and to create initiatives from within the neighborhoods that would begin to first provide first aid and support people in cleaning the rubble and closing the homes with nylon. And you see here many, many actors. So you see university students, you see universities formally getting involved in this, but you also see a lot of youth-led initiatives, many of which had already built a lot of experience working on the ground, particularly since October 2019 during the protest, and who will transpose their repertoire of action that they had during the protest to these districts. So we see psychological clinics to support people who are traumatized by the blast. We also see teach-ins where people sit together and are informed about the regulatory framework that may influence the recovery. But you also see initiatives as this one, which was led by the Beirut Urban Lab, to coordinate across the multiple actors. And this is when we realized that among the actors who were present is a very high number of international non-governmental organizations. And these INGOs, they've been in Lebanon, especially since 2012, because they are responding to the Syrian refugee crisis. But although the number of refugee crisis has not, although the number of refugees has not gone down, what is happening here is that the money coming for these refugees is going down. And so the INGOs find a new space in which there's potentially international support and solidarity. And they also flock the space of the reconstruction and posit themselves as in charge of coordinating. So OCHA, which coordinates the activities of the UN for refugees, is actually coordinating the recovery of the districts and transposing the same groups that were doing refugee response to the neighborhoods. And so begins this sort of amalgamation of international non-governmental organizations, NGOs that are local, some of them brilliant, really working at the service of the community, and activists with a strong absence of the state, except for the army that eventually rolled down 2 weeks after the blast in the district, with a lot of claims that there are thefts, that people are being rowdy, but which really accompanies the fact that there were big protests happening to render the government accountable that are violently stopped by the police force, but also by the presence of the army, etc. And so it is a framework to imagine recovery where the actors don't seem to make sense. And there are attempts by professional planners, most notable among them, the Order of Engineers and Architects, that deploys an army of volunteers and really surveys the damages. There are many volunteer interventions by the private sector, but when you take a step back and you look 3 months after, you have a sense that there's a mess. Worse, 2 months after the blast, the parliament passes regulation about to sort of support the recovery process. But the law that is, reading the law that is passed, one at first impression has an idea that this is a pro-people law, because the law prevents all land sales in the district with the claim that by preventing this, they will prevent predatory developers from coming and purchasing properties from impoverished people. It puts a halt on evictions due to mortgages and unpaid rents for a year, and sort of forms a coordination body that will accompany the recovery. But a closer look at the law tells us a few more concerning elements. First, the committee that's in charge of the recovery is headed by the army. So we have a handful of public organizations, some of which, like the Director General of Archaeology or the Director or the President of the Order of Engineers and Architects, that have played a very central role, many of which we have not seen at all in the process. The role of the army or of this committee is actually to channel the funds that will come from abroad to support the reconstruction, because all the Lebanese state is capable of offering is 300 million of the 3 billion or so that are needed. So the rest will have to come from external charity, from loans when they come, and hence will be subject to negotiations with international donors, whether they're willing to trust Lebanon and whether Lebanon is able or willing to comply with the decisions that are being put on the country. So there is no internal process of recovery that is imagined. As for residents, the law doesn't specify at all who will rebuild, how it will be rebuilt, what are the processes, how materials will be secured, what is the framework in which it will happen. And when you interview residents, you have this sense of loss. I don't know where to start. So if you're lucky and an NGO has intervened and is repairing your building, you're happy. But for the vast majority, there's a sense of loss. There's also a sense of negotiation between landlords and tenants, because many of the landlords whose homes are held under old rent control prefer not to repair the house and to wait until they sell it. And the final point I will make to just complicate your picture a little bit more is about the tool that is used by the law to sort of protect people and keep them in place, which is this prevention from selling property for 2 years. Eventually, it is adopted. When I read this, I was really surprised because, you know, there's a lot of absentee owners in this district. And if one is serious about recovering the life of the neighborhoods, there are many things that one can think about as incentives to encourage residents to come back by regulating the rental agreement, by providing landlords with incentives to repair their homes, by providing securities to both in terms of rapidly fixing infrastructure. And so this law didn't seem to make sense. And so when you see a regulation that doesn't make sense, you compare it to where else it has been used. And consistently, what we see in the history of Lebanon is preventions of sales in the cities are usually one of the strategies that's deployed in sectarian tensions so that you keep a district only Muslim or only Christian in this case. So what is happening here is a pumping by political parties of the old sectarian rhetoric that these are Christian neighborhoods that will actually be bought up by Muslims who will threaten the life of the neighborhood and will make eventually the political parties lose their ground. So at that point, an interpretation of this sort, and I'm being, of course, speculative because I have not interviewed the parliamentarians that does them, but it falls very logically in the trajectory of the individuals who have championed the law and explains why, while some of them are actually developers and were invested in the process of building and evicting in the 20 years before the blast, are ready now to put a hold on the evictions or the transfer of property, I should say, precisely because it allows them to protect the territory in the city. And so what this becomes is a process of negotiating between sectarian territories, frontiers of capitalism, as my friend Heba Bouakar would say, and eventually leaving a process of negotiation among public decision makers that's very dissociated from the realities I described on the ground and the efforts of activists, professionals, and NGOs trying to sort of recover what they think of as hopeful for the future of the city. It's too early to predict how it will all close, of course. So, but we can already see some of the terms on which the recovery is being brokered. So I cannot leave with a note of hope or a claim that I actually see Beirut recovering quickly or in a good way. But what I think is important to keep in mind is that when we look at events like the Beirut port explosion or any other crisis that have become a big field in the discipline of urban planning, where post-disaster recovery is gaining a lot of importance, it is really critical that we understand that the crisis that plagues all of our cities, or at least most of them across the globe, crisis of the absence of public custodians of the shared common good, the increasing financialization of specifically the housing sector, and the loss of shelter as a right for so many people, which we've also seen in the case of the COVID crisis in so many cities where homelessness has increased, where impoverishment has doubled, and where the consequences of the crisis are lived again very inequitably among populations, and where the crisis really exacerbates vulnerabilities and social divisions and inequities in societies. What I want to leave you with is the importance of working on these issues outside of the moments of crisis and ahead of the moments of that the cities face. Because I do think, and from the numbers we have in Beirut and from the observations we are making, that the decision to financialize the real estate sector of Beirut and to encourage capital to flow into it as an investment, and eventually to really turn Beirut into a city for sale and its quarters as safety deposit boxes where people can store wealth, has really affected the city in worse form than the blast that attracted so much attention. Thank you.